I'm Max Keiser. This is the Keiser Report. Well, wheels are coming off different places. Stacy?
Right. Well, you and I have been covering here on the Keiser Report for the last decade at least, but especially over the last 6 months as we lead up to the 50th year of fiat, when the U.S. went off the gold standard on August 15th, 1971. We've been looking at all the problems of the Triffin dilemma with, all the consequences of the exorbitant privilege. And one of the things you see is, as we've covered in Nigeria, where they've turned to Bitcoin. We've seen hyper-Bitcoinization there because they had no access to dollars during this crisis, during COVID, as world trade shut down. We're seeing a similar situation emerge in Sri Lanka, and I believe Bitcoin fixes this. Sri Lanka declares food emergency as Forex crisis worsens. Sri Lanka has declared a state of emergency over food shortages that, according to the government, are caused by hoarding, as private banks say they are running out of foreign exchange to finance imports. The move followed a sharp rise in the price of sugar, rice, onions, and other basic ingredients.
Right. Forex markets are causing food shortages. And with Bitcoin, you don't need a Forex market. That's the plain and obvious and simple truth. And country after country is beginning to realize they can escape the matrix of Forex dominated by corrupt players who control US dollar, and they can have sovereignty, true sovereignty. If you have reliance on the US dollar, you do not have sovereignty, full stop.
This is part of what we've been covering with the Triffin dilemma, is that there's always going to be that dilemma where a fiat currency, a national currency is the world's reserve currency, is during a time of crisis, whether it's the 2008, 2009 financial crisis or the COVID pandemic and lockdowns, what happens is, obviously, the elected leaders are going to allocate all their time and resources to the domestic population, and the international population, therefore, has no currencies with which to trade. We saw that with Nigeria. That's why they went to hyper-Bitcoinization, because there was still, their economy, by the way, didn't shut down that much because it's much younger and they can't afford to shut down. So they had demand still for used cars in Nigeria. But there were no U.S. dollars with which to trade with Japan or trade with China for used cars to be imported into Nigeria. So either they could have just said, okay, well, because we can't get dollars, we're just going to starve to death. Instead, they turned to Bitcoin. And here is a solution, I think, to Sri Lanka. Is the problem is the government's actually having to shut down imports in order to avoid further depletion of their reserves, because they said the economy shrank by a record 3.6% in 2020 because of the pandemic. And in March last year, the government banned imports of vehicles and other items, including edible oils and turmeric, an essential spice in local cooking, in a bid to save foreign exchange. However, importers still say they have been unable to source dollars to pay for the food and medicines that they are allowed to buy. So their foreign exchange reserves have absolutely plummeted. And we'll get into that, but basically it was down to $2.8 billion in July from $7.3 billion in November.
Right, so this is part of the theme of the collapse of globalization, the collapse of dollarization, and one might argue the collapse of neoliberalism. The American model, the Washington consensus. And countries are starting to reject that full plate of foreign influence. And in places like El Salvador, they're simply going to a Bitcoin standard, and their GDP is set to double in the next couple of years.
Right. But again, the point about this story about Sri Lanka is there's demand, there's desire, they want these products. They're not allowed to have these products because in order to do so would require foreign exchange being sent overseas, because they have a shortage of dollars. So if you had a neutral currency, a neutral payments rail, whereby any demand could be met through the payments rail, despite the situation of global trade, you wouldn't have these sort of situations whereby Sri Lanka's foreign reserves, as I said, fell to 2.8 billion at the end of July from 7.5 billion. Sorry, I said 7.3 billion, but $7.5 billion in November of 2019 when the government took office, and the rupee has lost more than 20% of its value against the US dollar in that time, according to the bank. Energy Minister Udaya Gamanpila has appealed to motorists to use fuel sparingly so that the country can use its foreign exchange to buy essential medicines and vaccines.
Right. Well, who benefits from these Forex markets? It's the people who are in the money changing business, and they get an override on all that money sloshing in, sloshing out, and they get a commission, they get a rentier, globalized, financialized economy. And when it breaks down, whether through the pandemic crisis or the global financial crisis, the people who are not financiers are all going to get penalized. The financiers are not getting penalized, right? They're using this as an opportunity to even gouge more from the people. That's why the people, and we see it in El Salvador, have said, you know what? We're just going to go to a Bitcoin standard and get rid of the whole lot of you.
Well, the El Salvador experiment is ongoing. I think it's an experiment which will prove to displace, especially for developing economies. And even the Financial Times is now reporting this, that Bitcoin makes sense for a developing economy because of these issues like Forex reserves and trying to manage inflation, trying to manage the problem here in Sri Lanka is very high inflation in these staples. Of course, we at Keiser Report saw this back in 2010, 2011, after a similar situation whereby a huge amount of money printing met a financial crisis. And now we have even more money printing meeting this pandemic crisis. And the domestic economy could keep on like just printing and printing to feed the people, whereas the how it filters out to the rest of the world is what ends up costing huge inflation. And then we saw in 2010 and 11 crises across the world and huge riots and governments overthrown. So we'll keep an eye on what's happening in Sri Lanka, but this could just be the first of many stories to come if history rhymes with what happened in 2010 and 2011, in which we covered here. But, of course, there's somebody as well that's winning, and another nation that's winning during this whole crisis, because yes, indeed, Americans are by and large getting huge quantities of stimulus checks, enhanced unemployment benefits. So for those who don't understand, like what the enhanced unemployment benefits have been, is that you get your normal unemployment benefits that everybody has. If they were made unemployed, they got their standard unemployment benefits. That was, for the past few decades, the expectation of what you would get. On top of that, they got an extra $600 a week on top of their ordinary benefits. So a lot of people were making a whole bunch more money. On top of that, they also didn't have to pay rent and they didn't have to pay their mortgages. Many millions of people didn't do that for the past 18 months. So they were flush with cash. Some people get upset in the comments saying that they deserve this and blah, blah, blah. What we're talking about is the macro consequences of that, because obviously they're staying at home, they're receiving these enhanced unemployment benefits, they're not paying rent, but they're flush with cash and they want to buy, and they spend and spend and spend on durable goods. Who's still working? We're not working here, obviously, but they are working in China. China's exports strengthen despite COVID-19 disruptions. August data shows shipments of appliances, furniture, and clothing grew, helping offset waning demand for pandemic-related goods. China's exports unexpectedly expanded at a faster clip in August, shrugging off the impact of a global resurgence of the coronavirus pandemic, port congestion, and supply bottlenecks. China's outbound shipments rose 25.6% in August from a year earlier, higher than the 19.3% increase in July. The General Administration of Customs said on Tuesday. The results also comfortably topped the 17% increase expected by economists polled by the Wall Street Journal.
Right. So the money printing in the U.S., the stimulus checks are going, for the most part, to China. And it gives them economic power, which supports their geopolitical position. And it's no accident that they're also getting a little bit more, let's call it self-confident in their disposition toward some of their neighboring countries and territories.
This is not inflation adjusted. So if there was money printing on the order of 23% last year, I'm assuming that that's also adjusted there. So that's not yet adjusted. So the increase of 26% might just be a reflection of all the money printing. But nevertheless, the fact that the economy remains open, as we have covered with Stan Druckenmiller, the famous hedge fund manager, has taken a bet against the US dollar in the past year and is long on Asia, in particular China, because of the fact that they haven't had to money print and they're still open and they're creating wealth. This is called wealth creation. And it is a situation similar to post-World War II, where America saw those sort of numbers for themselves, like they were producing all the manufactured goods in the world. And we had the era of Detroit and things like that. So China could be in a similar situation. Who knows? We could end up in a nuclear war instead. And it would all go horribly wrong. But in the meantime, shipments to each of China's major trading partners increased at a faster year-over-year pace in August than in the prior month, according to calculations based on the official data. Exports to the European Union, which is China's number 2 trading partner, jumped by 29.4% in August from a year earlier, accelerating from July's 17.2% rise, while shipments to the Association of Southeast Asian Nations and the U.S., China's number 1 and 3 trading partners, respectively, rose 16.6% and 15.5%.
Yeah, the U.S. really missed a trick here. Remember under FDR during the Depression, he created jobs, the public works programs, and they built dams. They built the Hoover Dam, I believe. They built Rockefeller Center. They built roads. They built bridges. And America needs infrastructure rebuild. They just went to Congress to get multi-trillion-dollar infrastructure build package. But here, under this administration, instead of making up jobs with that money, they're just de facto sending it to China, that money. So they could have actually rebuilt the infrastructure with the same amount of money that they're sent to China. But they're going to pass another bill in Washington to do the infrastructure, and we know that will never make it to the work either. It gets stuck in the banks. And into that chasm is 200 million Americans, and they're just being disenfranchised.
Yep, all that money goes to the banks, which goes to the big contractors, the multinational ones, which they don't do any of the work. They subcontract it, who subcontracts that, and then it filters down to a few pennies to a local road. I mean, basically the Afghanistan model, what we did in Afghanistan.
Well, that's great. We're going to take a break. And when we come back, much more coming your way. Welcome back to the Keiser Report. I'm Max Keiser. Time now to return to our conversation with Michael Pinto, PintoPort.com. Michael, welcome back.
Always good to be with you, Max. Well,
your latest missive that goes out to your followers is entitled The Great Deflation of 2022. Okay, so you're looking ahead to next year, and so you're thinking that there's gonna, and in our previous segment we talked about the Nikkei average back in 1989. It had a huge collapse. It peaked out at 40,000 on the Nikkei. There was this 20-year deflationary period. So you're making a comparison. You think that the U.S. is on the cusp of something similar. Do I have that right?
I absolutely think that the valuation of equities now at 207% of GDP is something similar to what they saw in Japan. Do you know in Paul Volcker's day, when he raised rates to 20%, the valuation of equities as compared to GDP was 35%. So I just don't see the Fed being able to fight inflation the way they did before. So I think this might be a truncated period of deflation. And then I think they come back with this massive fiscal and monetary package. And it'll be at that juncture where I will join the inflationistas and believe that the Fed is going to engender, and the Treasury is going to engender, intractable stagflation with rising interest rates and plunging GDP growth, because we're going to lose all confidence in our Federal Reserve to support the dollar and the U.S. bond market. I think that's sad to say, but I think the game is over, Max. You know, the Fed keeps bluffing that we can normalize interest rates. But as I said in the last segment, you take the Fed funds rate to 5.25%, and you're going to be 125 basis points higher than junk bonds. So you're going to blow up the CLO market, the leverage loan market, the junk bond market, the shadow banking system. You are going to have a deflationary depression like we've never seen before in this country. They make the 30s look like a walk in the park. So they can't really fight this inflation. And we have the same inflation that we have today is the same inflation that Paul Volcker had to fight in the late 70s and early 80s.
To look at that number again, 207% of GDP is the valuation of the stock market. I believe the Buffett rule is that he thinks stocks get pricey if they exceed 100% of GDP. And here we are, 200% of GDP. So clearly, by any measure, by any metric, stocks are extraordinarily high. If you were to strip out the stock buyback programs and you had a real accurate look at earnings, that price earnings ratio would be closer, on average, would be closer to probably 50 PE, which again would be highest, one of the highest ever in history. So this idea, that, of course, the whole exercise of money printing and quantitative easing was always that, well, we jumpstart the economy and then we get taxes flowing and then we're going to pay down that debt with those taxes. You know, the trickle down. This goes all the way back to Reagan and trickle down economics, David Stockton. This has been with us now for 40 years, Michael. Would it be fair to say that what you're saying here is we've reached the end game of this 40-year trickle-down experiment?
Well, you could also look at price to sales, which strips out all that engineered earnings that they like to report on the S&P 500. We're at a record high price to sales too. So the game changer here, the watershed epiphany moment that we've reached here in the United States, is that we've now engendered inflation. All the other times before we had a crisis, the crisis engendered deflation, and we had to try to attack it by lowering interest rates and printing money. Well, we could do that because the salient issue was deflation. And a prolonged period, protracted period of deflation. But if you have a situation where we have a truncated period of deflation, which deploys modern monetary theory once again, and helicopter money once again, the Fed's credibility is blown. So like you were alluding to with the question, this is no longer an experiment. This is no longer an emergency measure. This is something that's permanent. We can never drain the balance sheet of the Federal Reserve. We can never raise interest rates. We can never end QE. We can never support the purchasing power of the dollar, not versus the euro. I'm not talking about now the dollar on the DXY or the Bloomberg Dollar Index. I'm talking about supporting the dollar against real estate and stocks and hard assets and precious metals. You never do that. So the game would be over because we have jumped the shark with inflation.
What about structurally speaking? You know, back in the 2008 crash, remember the money market funds, there was a threat of breaking the buck, and extraordinary measures were introduced to stop that from happening. And Tim Geithner and Hank Paulson, they got together and they kind of rewrote all regulations as they apply to financial markets to make it possible to just channel in just torrents of cash and to strip out a lot of those regulations. So you're, as you point out, you're a money manager. You do this day in and day out. What have you seen structurally? Is there a risk of the wheels actually falling off at this point? Are there any safeguards in place, or is it just a house of cards ready to blow?
I'll choose the latter, Max. We have a record amount of margin debt. A record amount of margin debt as a percentage of GDP. We have the biggest junk bond market in history with the tightest spreads to treasuries and the lowest rate in history. We have the highest real estate values in history. The home price to income ratio is the highest it has ever been outside of maybe 1 month in 2005. We have the biggest bubble in the bond market, real estate, and stock market. We have a triumvirate of bubbles and at record proportions. And the problem here now is that the Fed is, as they always do, They always threaten to normalize monetary policy. And when they do, the chaos will begin. The deflation will begin. The markets will unravel very quickly. I think you're going to have circuit breakers hit. The credit markets will freeze once again. And then you're going to have Powell. I think he will be reappointed because Janet Yellen loves him and gave her blessing. I don't know why this billionaire private equity guy wants this job. He should just sail off into the sunset come the end of this year. But he wants the job, and it's going to be his decision then to increase his balance sheet, which I will remind you, and I know you know this, and so does your audience. This balance sheet of the Federal Reserve was $800 billion in December of 2007. It is now well over $8 trillion. This balance sheet is going to increase by trillions of dollars per annum after the next crisis. And I just cannot fathom how that engenders any kind of confidence in our treasury market, across the bond fixed income market, and in the stock market.
Well, let me ask you this. Back in the 2008 crisis, the Lehman moment caused global contagion. Since that time, particularly in Asia, countries have been buying hundreds of tons of gold and preparing themselves for the next crisis, insulating themselves against the contagion and de-dollarizing. Russia, for example, has gotten rid of all their dollars. China seems to have insulated themselves against the China, doing the dollar with bilateral deals. Will this be a similar contagion when this thing blows up, or will this be weigh most heavily in the U.S.?
So I just backtest history. I know you might disagree with this, but when the largest economy on the planet goes down, and you're going to bring down Europe and Japan with us. So you're going to take Europe, Japan, and the United States offline. And the dollar is probably the most shorted currency on the planet, maybe second to Japan, the yen. You're going to have a lot of people who are going to be invested with dollar-denominated debt in other countries that's going to have to sell that debt and buy back dollars. So I am not predicting a dollar demise vis-a-vis other currencies. Not when this chaos hits. But ex post the chaos, I am telling you that the dollar will probably decline against hard assets like it has never declined before. But to specifically answer your question, I do not see a world where the United States goes down and the rest of the world sails off into some kind of nirvana concurrently. It's just not going to happen. It's not based in history, and it's not based in real economics.
As a money manager, when you see the chaos in Kabul and Afghanistan, does that ripple through as a risk event that confidence in the U.S. and the U.S. military is ebbing? Is that a risk event for you?
It is indicative. I don't know if it's a risk event where you trade on it, because you notice the dollar hasn't lost much value ever since we did the debacle in Afghanistan. Like I said, it's still marginally up on the year. But it does tell you that confidence in our president, confidence in our Federal Reserve, confidence in our Treasury is completely misplaced confidence. These people have no idea what they're doing. I mean, the Fed still has this staid model of Phillips curve saying that inflation comes from too many people working, when it's the exact opposite. Inflation comes from too many people not working and giving them money to stay home and consume. So all of their theories are wrong. And the fact that the US military supports our currency and our bond market and took a torpedo to the bow it is part of that picture that ex post the next crisis, when we embrace a permanent condition of child income tax credits, enhanced unemployment, helicopter money, MMT, that will all serve to expedite the demise of the dollar as the world's reserve currency.
Yeah, on the global risk front, speaking about COVID here, we've got the new variants are making their presence known. Explosion and breakthrough cases. What's happening in Israel is seemingly pretty remarkable. They're on their fourth booster jab. Cases are not diminishing at all. Again, from a risk perspective, that would cut into the consumer dollar at some point, seemingly. We've got about 20 seconds left. Is that a concern?
Let me stop you because I'm going to give Max. It shows you how smart you really are and how I enjoy coming on your program. So I look at COVID-19 and its variants, and I think there's going to be a vaccine-resistant variant emerging soon if there's not one already. Israel is very important. Their cases aren't diminishing; they're skyrocketing. I follow Israel because they're the country that has the best vaccination program going, but their deaths are rising and their cases are soaring. So that has to be part of any good active money management. What's happening with COVID? And so far the news is daunting, to say the least.
Well, I wouldn't want to be sitting in your chair down there in Florida because you've got to deal with an awful lot of things going on, but somehow you managed to give your clients excellent performance. Michael, thanks so much for being on Keiser Report.
Always my pleasure, Max.
And that's going to do it for this edition of Keiser Report. With me, Max Keiser, and Stacy Herbert. I want to thank our guest, Michael Pento of pentoport.com. Until next time, bye, y'all.